My husband of 16 years was publishing chronicles of our private life on a very successful anonymous blog. I found out when a student quoted in class something I had said at home the week before. There are moments in the classroom where something a student says produces in you a reaction that has nothing to do with the class, that has to do with something different that has just touched a nerve you did not expect to be touched there. The student was talking about the genre of personal chronicle, about how the best chroniclers used everyday life as literary material, about how the apparently insignificant details of domestic intimacy could become observations about the human condition when the eye looking at them was sufficiently sharp. And then she quoted a fragment from a blog she found a perfect example of that. A fragment about a couple arguing over whether or not a jam jar should be thrown out when it was half full, that the husband used as a point of entry to talk about how small domestic negotiations reveal two people's value systems in ways no philosophical conversation could. It was a good fragment. It was also word for word the conversation I had had with my husband Eduardo the Thursday of the previous week. My name is Isabel. I am 44 years old. I am a professor of Latin American literature at a private university, and I have been married for 16 years to Eduardo, who is 47 and who is an academic books editor. Eduardo was the most careful person with words I had ever known. Not in the sense of cautious, in the sense of someone who treats language with the seriousness of one who knows words do things, who reads with an attention most people do not have, who when he speaks chooses what he says in a way I had admired from the beginning. That capacity with language was part of what I had fallen in love with about him. It was also, as I discovered that Thursday in my classroom, what made his chronicles what they were. Extraordinarily good, and completely without my knowledge or consent. I asked the student for the blog's name. She gave it to me. I continued the class, now with half my head somewhere else, with almost all of my head somewhere else, holding the class with the autopilot you develop after 20 years of teaching while inside you process something that does not have a name yet. That afternoon in my office, I opened the blog. It was called The Domestic Life of Nobody in Particular. It had 2 years of posts, 147 entries, a first-person narrative voice that described the everyday life of a couple without using names. Him, her, the house, the conversations, the minor arguments, the moments of silence, the morning and evening rituals, the small revelations that happen when two people have spent enough years sharing a space. I started reading from the first entry. It took 3 hours to confirm what I knew in the first 10 minutes. It was our life, our house, our conversations, my words, my reactions, my specific ways of saying things, my vulnerabilities that Eduardo knew exactly because he had seen them up close for 16 years. All there, in 147 entries. Read by the people who commented below, each one with the fervor of those who recognize themselves in something. The blog had 84,000 subscribers. I did not cry that afternoon. What I felt was not exactly tears. It was something more like the disorientation of someone who has just discovered that the space they thought most private in their life has also been inhabited by tens of thousands of people they do not know, without their having chosen it, without their having known. Every conversation of the last 2 years, every small argument, every moment of tenderness, everything I had said thinking it existed only between Eduardo and me. There, public, applauded, commented on, used as material by someone who also slept beside me every night. I arrived home. Eduardo was in his study. I opened the door. I told him we needed to talk. He looked at me in the way he looks at me when he knows something important is coming. I told him a student had quoted in class a fragment from blog, that the fragment was our Thursday conversation, that I had read the blog. Eduardo did not say anything immediately, and that silence told me what I needed to know before he said a single word. The conversation that followed was the longest and most difficult of 16 years together. I'm not going to reproduce it completely, but I will share what matters from it. Eduardo told me he had started writing the blog 2 years ago as a way of processing everyday life, that he had found in writing a way of looking at what we live that he could not have without the distance writing it gives, that at first it had been completely private, that at some point he had made it public without anticipating the reach it would come to have. That when readers started arriving and connecting with what he wrote, he had not known how to stop. That he had thought about telling me on multiple occasions. That each time he had found a reason not to. I asked him whether he had thought about my perspective, about what it meant for me to be on those pages without knowing it. That my words, my reactions, my vulnerabilities were available to 84,000 people I did not know. That in every new conversation we had, I was being observed without knowing I was being observed. That changed the nature of those conversations in a way I had not chosen. Eduardo said yes, that he had thought about it, that he had rationalized it in ways he now saw for what they were. Rationalizations. That writing had become something so important to him that he had chosen to protect it over the transparency he owed me. That honesty was the most important and most difficult of the entire conversation. Because what Eduardo was telling me was not that he had not thought about me. It was that he had thought about me and had chosen anyway. I told him the blog had to be closed, not in negotiation. As a condition, Eduardo said yes, that he would close it that night. I told him I also needed us to understand together how we had gotten there, not to assign blame. To understand what in our dynamic had made it possible for this to happen for 2 years without my knowing, because something in that dynamic also needed to be named. The blog was closed that night. Eduardo published a final entry that said only that the blog was closing, without giving explanations. The readers' comments lamenting the closing were their own witness to what he had built with material that was not only his. What followed in the subsequent months was a process that has not yet ended. We started couples therapy, not because our relationship was broken, but because what had come out required more space than conversations between us to be completely processed. What emerged in therapy was more complex than the simple story of the writer who uses their life as material. Eduardo had found in the blogs, writing a space where he could be completely honest about what he felt and thought about our life. A space that did not exist in the same way in our direct conversations. That said something about us that was more important than the blog. That in 16 years, I had also built expectations of Eduardo as a partner that made a certain kind of honesty difficult to have within the relationship. That Eduardo had found public writing as a substitute for conversations he should have had with me. And that was also something I needed to process. The irony of being a literature professor and being in this situation did not escape me. I spend years talking with my students about writers' right to use life as material, about the limits of autofiction, about when literature has the right to appropriate reality. And when that question arrived in my own life, the answer was not the one I would have given in a classroom. It was more personal, more uncomfortable, and more informative about what those questions really mean when they're not abstract. What I wanted to take from this story has parts for people in different positions. For those who write or create using their life and the lives of those around them. The consent of the people who appear in what you write is not a bureaucratic detail. It is the difference between writing about shared life and taking something that belongs to both of you to make it only yours. That difference is not always obvious when you are inside the creative process. That is why it is worth naming before it becomes necessary. For those who recognize themselves in Isabel's position, discovering that someone has been observing your life with a writer's eye without telling you is discovering there was a dimension of the relationship you did not know. Processing that takes time, and also requires asking the difficult question about what in the relationship's dynamic had created the space for that parallel observation to exist. That question can be uncomfortable. It can also be the most useful of all the questions that emerge from the situation. If this story touched you, comment. Do you believe there's a line between writing about one's own life and writing about the life shared with another person? Or do you believe whoever writes has the right to use everything they live as material? Like if you believe the consent of people who appear in autobiographical or nonfiction texts should be an explicit conversation and not something assumed. Subscribe for more real stories. Share with someone who is a writer or who is in a relationship with someone who writes and who might resonate with some part of this story. Reflection to take with you. Shared life produces material that belongs to both. When one of the two turns it into public work without the other's knowledge, they are not only exercising a creative right, they are taking something from the shared intimacy and making it available to the world without the other person having been able to choose. That decision, even when it comes from a genuine creative impulse, has real consequences for the person who did not choose to be material.